In 1949, something strange started happening on the outskirts of New York. Houses began appearing out of nowhere, almost overnight. 2, 3, or 4 houses would have been odd enough, but in this instance, the structures seemed to be multiplying by the thousands, stretching across what, until recently, were potato fields in perfect rows with identical designs, roofs, and lawns. It was mass production that truly lived up to its name. Rather than creating cars or appliances, someone had figured out a way to craft ready-made homes, neighborhoods, and cities in a fraction of the time. And that person's name was William Levitt, the man who invented the suburbs. But the who is not the interesting part, because while the development of suburban areas across the United States solved a lot of problems, it also created some that were far, far worse. In the mid to late 1940s, America was facing a massive challenge. World War II was over, and millions of soldiers were now returning home, starting families, and looking for somewhere to live. The problem was that housing was in very short supply. New home construction had screeched to a halt during the war, as lumber, steel, and cement were redirected to build more ships, planes, and military infrastructure. Cities, meanwhile, were already overpopulated with people who had relocated to work in shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants. In the face of surging demand for properties, the construction industry had to acknowledge that it was simply too slow, too expensive, and too fragmented to get the job done. William Levitt, a real estate investor from New York City, believed he had a better way. Not only was his vision an ideal solution, it would go on to completely transform how Americans live. He called it Levittown. Before 1950, the process of building a house was slow, deliberate, and craft-driven. A team of specialists would arrive on site and construct a home from the ground up, starting with the foundation before moving on to the framing, roofing, plumbing, and electrical. The same workers handled multiple tasks, often moving back and forth between projects. It was a collaboration of highly skilled labor, but it was brutally inefficient. And so, William Levitt came up with an idea. Instead of treating each house as a unique project, he believed that they should be treated as products on an assembly line. He often spoke of being directly inspired by Henry Ford's mass production methods, which had already proved instrumental in making the automobile more affordable for American families. Now Levitt was going to do the same, but for housing. In 1949, he and his firm, Levitt & Sons, set about redesigning the entire construction process around speed and specialization. The first thing they did was break the entire home building process down into 26 separate steps. Next, they assigned each step to a specialized crew whose sole job was to perform that task repeatedly at a new property. Rather than hiring a team to build a single house from start to finish, Levitt & Sons crews went from house to house, repeating their task hundreds of times. If you poured concrete slabs, that was all you did. If you installed framing, that was all you did. When you were done, you moved on to the next home in the series. It was construction as choreography, and the result was astonishing efficiency. But as with most optimization, it required sacrifices. For starters, traditional builders relied heavily on skilled carpenters. These men were meticulous, as that was the only way to ensure the best results. But Levitt minimized the need for them by simplifying construction techniques and standardizing parts. And that was just one example. Instead of digging deep basements, he built houses on concrete slabs, eliminating excavation, reducing costs, and dramatically speeding up construction. Rather than bulky radiators and boilers, many Levittown homes used radiant floor heating, with hot water pipes embedded directly into the slab. Materials were purchased in massive quantities to reduce costs even further, and when that didn't lower prices enough, Levitt set up his own lumber yards, concrete plants, and prefabrication facilities. This allowed him to ensure that every component needed to construct a fully functional house arrived ready to install. And at its peak, the system was blindingly efficient, with a new finished house rolling off Levitt's suburban assembly line every 16 minutes. But what did these houses actually look like? While speed was utterly vital to what Levitt was trying to accomplish, it also required that the houses themselves be standardized. This meant that every design decision, from the floor plan to the color of the siding, had to serve the goal of efficiency. The first Levittown homes were modest Cape Cod-style houses, about 750 square feet. Inside were 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. They included an unfinished attic, which provided room for families to expand if they wished. This layout wasn't random. In fact, Levitt's team spent months studying how families actually used their homes. The result was one of the most successful introductions of design psychology in history. Take, for instance, the placement of the kitchen. In Levitt homes, the kitchen always faced the street. At first glance, it might seem unusual, but it actually allowed mothers, who were often home during the day, to watch children play outside while working inside. That's the level of thinking that was going on at Levitt & Sons, and it bled over into every aspect of the process. For instance, Levitt homes came fully equipped with a refrigerator, oven, washing machine, built-in cabinets, and modern plumbing, all included in the price. This was highly unusual at the time, but it had the benefit of not only simplifying pricing, but also purchasing. Instead of coordinating appliances separately, Levitt installed them directly during construction. By purchasing in bulk, he was able to extend his margins. Materials are another good example. Exterior walls used uniform siding, while roof lines were repeated across entire blocks. Even the colors were selected from a controlled palette. This is why suburban areas are often referred to as planned communities. When they were done, it was nearly impossible to tell one street from the next. With standardization came predictability. Every crew knew exactly what to install and where. Every component fit perfectly because it was designed to do so. This virtually eliminated delays while maximizing repetition and reducing costs. Each new Levittown home sold for about $7,000, or around $100,000 in today's money. This made them affordable enough for many returning veterans, especially with government-backed mortgages from the GI Bill. It was a no-brainer. At one point in 1949, 650 houses were sold in just a few hours. Entire neighborhoods filled with young families almost overnight. But while the suburbs would come to symbolize middle-class normality, the Levittown blueprint carried problems that would ripple through American cities for decades. Henry Ford may have inspired Levitt's production method, but by the time the latter was done, Ford would have owed him a debt, because nothing did more for cars in the 1950s than the creation of the suburbs. Levittown neighborhoods were built far outside traditional cities, where land was cheap and space was abundant. Homes sat along winding residential streets, with schools, parks, and shopping centers spread out across the development. It seemed idyllic at first, until you tried to walk it. In his desire to reject urban density, Levitt had created another problem. The distances between homes, stores, and workplaces were simply too large to travel on foot. To make matters worse, public transit rarely reached out to these new developments. Suddenly, everyday life depended on driving. Groceries, work, school, entertainment, everything required a vehicle. Unknowingly, Levittown helped accelerate a new pattern in American life known as suburban sprawl, in which cities spread outward rather than upward. Over the coming decades, this would completely change transportation, infrastructure, and daily routines while creating a reliable demand for vehicles that has never gone away. The second problem was more existential. The mass production of homes, neighborhoods, and cities resulted in block after block of identical houses, identical streets, and identical lawns. Critics began referring to them as storage units for humans. There was even a folk song, Little Boxes, which had been written to reflect the growing discomfort with this new suburban uniformity. And that's why it's so important to realize that not all of the uniformity came from the design. Living in Levittown came with strict rules. Residents were not allowed to paint their homes different colors. Fixtures like front yard fences were forbidden, and making major exterior changes to your own home required approval. The goal was to protect property values by ensuring every house looked essentially the same. But over time, that consistency began to feel restrictive. A process that was supposed to standardize architecture also standardized identity. entire communities began to look and often behave remarkably similar. And that led to perhaps the biggest problem. For many American families, Levittown represented opportunity, but for others, the doors were closed before they even arrived. In fact, the original Levittown lease agreements stated that homes could only be occupied by members of the Caucasian race. To be fair, these policies mirrored broader housing discrimination practices common across the United States at the time. But here they had an even bigger impact. As suburbs like Levittown became overwhelmingly white, minority communities often found themselves confined to urban neighborhoods with fewer resources and opportunities. Those who tried to break the barriers were met with fierce resistance. In 1957, an African-American family, the Myers, moved to a Levittown in Pennsylvania. Their arrival triggered weeks of protests, harassment, and national media coverage. Police even had to be deployed on several occasions, and crowds sometimes gathered around the family's home in hopes of driving them out. The same system that produced affordable homes at unprecedented speed also reinforced patterns of racial separation in American life in ways that would last decades. William Levitt is long gone, but his model changed the landscape of the United States forever. So next time you're driving around suburban America, take the time to look out your window. If you see identical houses and quiet, winding streets, you're not just looking at a neighborhood, you're in William Levitt's factory.